Dostoevsky was a master at taking the commonplace, the things that we all take for granted, and distilling them into a story that allows us to see the world in a different way. Finding the complexity in the everyday life and spinning it into a narrative. And he takes his time too. His books are very long, but he has this unbelievable ability to immediately pull you in, and he keeps you there the whole time. You're suspended in this frictionless circumambulation around a question that's maybe something that you have in the back of your mind, or maybe it's something you've never even asked yourself before. And the question he was trying to answer in his book, The Idiot, is, will beauty save the world? Saving the world. Well, we know a story about that already. It's an old story. In the West, it's the death and the resurrection. Christ becoming man to die for the sins of the world, and one day returning to bring about heaven on earth. That was something Dostoevsky wrote about in a later book called The Grand Inquisitor. That came after this book. It's not something that we'll get into today. But Myshkin, the main character in The Idiot, it seems like he was an early experiment that Dostoevsky was trying to use to answer this question. He represents the ideal image of Christ. He's returning to Russia to receive an inheritance. And throughout the book and all of his interactions, he displays this honesty and this humility and this childlike spirit that gets juxtaposed against a Russia that's now driven by secrets and hidden motives. Early on, he gets a nickname from one of the characters who calls him the Prince. This alludes to the Prince of Peace, but it could also allude to Machiavelli's The Prince, because it's a perfect contrast for Myshkin, who is the direct opposite of Machiavelli's character. And the nickname is not a term of endearment, it's a backhanded way of belittling him, and that's a reoccurring theme. In the eyes of the characters that meet him in the story, Myshkin is this endearing, good-hearted, but simple, well, he comes across as an idiot. He speaks plainly with people, he sees the good in others, and he finds joy being with children rather than being with adults because he doesn't really understand that world. He sees the openness and the sincerity of children, and he understands that. And that innocence isn't really a virtue to the others. They see it as a weakness, and they mock him for it. So Myshkin is a symbol of morality. He doesn't expect anything in return. He doesn't have a hidden agenda. He does the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing. And then there's another character in the story named Ganya. He's a foil for Myshkin. He represents this age of rationality that was coming into existence in Russia in the 1800s and the continual pursuit of personal gain. Ganya and Myshkin are cordial with one another, but they're also adversarial. They're in opposition. And at one point, they exchange rosary crosses with one another. And I think that's a very important point of the story. It's a symbol of trust between one another, and it's also a passing of the torch in a lot of ways. The burden the cross signifies and the responsibility that it bears, changing hands from the ethical and the religious into the hands of the enlightenment, objectivity, and the promise of a new age that's not constrained by religious views. But what happens is, in the same scene, Myshkin tries to murder Ganya out of rage. See, underneath that veneer of friendship, there's a nest of jealousy and contempt and competition that Ganya feels. He's completely driven by his impulses and a desire for power. And what Dostoevsky was trying to explore here was, if you perceive the world purely objectively, without any space for the religious, you wind up in this amoral, postmodern framework where good and evil are relative and they're only useful as far as they can serve a purpose. There's a line written that says the friend of humanity with shaky moral principles is also the devourer of humanity. If good is only relative and it serves the purpose of a subjective viewer, then they're not held accountable to any higher standard outside of themselves. So there's the situation between Ganya and Myshkin, and then there's a love triangle that takes place between Myshkin and two women, Nastasia and Agalia. Nastasia represents beauty. She's the promise of the future. She's unpredictable. She's constantly changing her mind, going back and forth between these two men. And at the end of the book, She leaves Myshkin at the altar for Ganya. She represents chaos. The other woman, Agalia, is order. She represents the traditional, the predictable, the steadfast. The whole time you know that Myshkin should choose her. You can see that that's his shot at happiness, but you can also see that there's something about the possibility of Nastasia that always draws him away from her. The whole dynamic seems a little bit obvious when you're reading it. If you're just looking at it as a love story, it wouldn't be that interesting, but there's something deeper going on here. Myshkin is being torn between these two women, and you can see that as his soul, beauty itself, being torn between the traditions of the past and the promise of the future. These feminine figures are the bearers of life in the story, the bedrock of creativity, the fountain of culture that's self-renewing. And Christ, similarly, is an intersection of those two polar opposites, heaven and hell. He reaches up into heaven towards his Father, and he reaches down into hell whenever he takes the sins of the world onto himself. And Myshkin is similarly reaching for these two realities at once. He's embodying that burden of Christ and reflecting it in his own life, trying to be a bridge to these two polar opposite forces. But the uniting force that holds that union together is broken. The religious ideal, the image of Christ, is broken in a rational age, and that uniting force is dissolved by that modern rationality, and he ends up losing them both and losing his mind. And that is the high order bit. Imitating Christ in an age of rationality leads to insanity, because you're trying to embody an ideal that's dead, and it's no longer animated by our traditions and our culture. We all hope that beauty will save the world, but what is beauty? What's beautiful? Well, beauty is how we all define it. If it's the ideals that are beautiful, then they will constantly restore themselves and renew, and they'll be sustaining, because ideals are something that rejuvenate and can never be fully achieved. But if rationality is what we hold as beautiful, then it serves facts. And those facts have no uniting principle that tells us what to do with them. Now, there's a scientific argument that says, no, beauty is a natural phenomenon. It emerges. It's not socially constructed. And we know that from the golden ratio, the concept of symmetry, all of these parameters of beauty that are defined by mathematics, and that's all well and good. But the postmodern critic would say, no, that's a particular view that was developed by Western culture, starting with the Greeks and the Romans. The idea of reason, logical coherence, the scientific method for that matter, all of that is now being viewed as a patriarchal enterprise. That's one way of seeing the world, and it's not objectively better than any other way of seeing the world. If there is no God, then everything is permitted. And when we can't agree on what beauty is because we all have this subjective, intersectional, relativistic view of the world, there's not a central conception of beauty that we can all strive towards together. There's a brilliant line in the book. It's unbelievable. It seems like it could have been written yesterday. It says, Russian liberalism is not an attack on the existing order of things, but is an attack on the very essence of things, on the things themselves, not merely on the order, not on the Russian regime, but on Russia itself. The image of Christ is a call for all of us to be more than we can be, to strive for the beauty defined in the principle that we're all made in God's image. And in a world where the essence of things has been uprooted and there's no uniting principle that guides us, the call to imitate Christ is a one-way ticket to the madhouse. But the good news is that we all have a choice. The great thing about Dostoevsky is he presents a problem to you, and then he lays out all the possible points of view. He tries to approach it from every angle, and he tries to see it from every possible perspective. But he doesn't give you an answer. He doesn't solve the problem for you. We, as the reader, get to take what he wrote and use it to inform our lives. And in the same way, we, as a culture, get to define beauty in every decision that we make.